This meeting is now called to order, starting with the acknowledgement in Ottawa, meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on April 29, 2021, the committee continues its study of sex trafficking of Indigenous peoples. To ensure an orderly meeting, remember to have the language of your choice selected, the globe icon in the bottom center of the screen. Select English or French or floor. And if you are speaking and then changing back and forth, you don't have to make any more adjustments. Just leave it on. When speaking, ensure that your video is turned on. Speak slowly and clearly. And when not speaking, you should be on mute. I must inform the committee, pursuant to Standing Order adopted on March 9th, 2021, that all witnesses have completed a technical pretest. With us this afternoon, our department officials, and I'm going to start with the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness Director General, Michelle Van de Bogart. Ms. Van de Bogart, would you please go ahead with 6 minutes of your testimony?
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me today to speak to the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. My name is Michelle Van de Bogart. I'm the Director General of the Law Enforcement and Border Strategies Directorate in the Community Safety and Countering Crime Branch at Public Safety Canada. My team and I are responsible for leading the Government of Canada's efforts to combat human trafficking. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge with gratitude that I'm currently in Ottawa on the unceded, unsurrendered land of the Algonquin. And I would also like to acknowledge that we recently all learned the devastating news about the uncovering of a mass grave of Indigenous children on the grounds of the former Kamloops Residential School. I would like to recognize and honor the lives of these children and the heartbreaking hardships that their families must have endured. The Government of Canada takes the issue of human trafficking very seriously and is committed to strengthening our efforts to combat this horrible crime. In September 2019, the Minister of Public Safety launched the National Strategy to Combat Human Trafficking, which brings together federal efforts under one strategic framework, supported by an investment of $57.22 million over 5 years and $10.28 million ongoing. The national strategy is based on the internationally recognized pillars of prevention, protection, prosecution, partnerships, and empowerment. This last pillar focuses on enhancing supports for victims affected by this crime. In addition, in 2018, the Government of Canada announced $14.5 million over 5 years and $2.89 million ongoing to create the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline. This hotline is a toll-free service available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that refers victims to local law enforcement, shelters, and other supports. It is able to field questions in more than 200 languages, including 27 Indigenous languages. Human trafficking is a complex and highly gendered crime, with root causes including poverty, racism, wage inequality, lack of education, and lack of employment opportunities, all of which we know Indigenous people experience disproportionately compared to other Canadians. Echoing what we heard during the pre-inquiry design process, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls identified human trafficking and sexual exploitation as a key issue. In addition, the MMIWG calls for justice reinforced the need to address the disproportionately high rates of violence against Indigenous women and girls, including sexual trafficking and sexual exploitation. Through the National Strategy to Combat Human Trafficking, the Government of Canada is taking action through various measures to address human trafficking among vulnerable populations. The Minister of Public Safety named Shirley Poirier, the Special Advisor to Combat Human Trafficking, to advise him and to raise awareness of the issue. The Special Advisor is actively engaged with the department, partners, and stakeholders to strengthen efforts to combat the sexual trafficking of Indigenous people. I am pleased to speak of the Government of Canada's investment of up to $22.4 million to fund 63 organizations' anti-human trafficking efforts. 33 of these organizations serve Indigenous people, and 10 are Indigenous-led projects. These 63 projects will increase access to services and support for victims and survivors, raise awareness of human trafficking among youth at risk, and develop innovative technological ideas to combat human trafficking. Raising awareness of human trafficking among Canadians is critical. Public Safety launched an awareness campaign entitled "It's Not What It Seems" to educate the public, especially youth and parents, about human trafficking. Indigenous specific focus groups were held in order to ensure their perspectives were included. It is important to ensure victims and survivors receive specialized services to support their recovery and healing. Public Safety is working to develop guidelines for service providers and community organizations, including specific guidelines to support Indigenous survivors. In addition to the guidelines, Public Safety is supporting the development of training tools for frontline service providers in the hospitality, transportation, and other key sectors in order to educate them on the signs of human trafficking and how to report it. Finally, in order to inform and influence federal anti-human trafficking efforts, Public Safety is establishing a Survivors Advisory Committee, including Indigenous survivors, to draw upon their lived experiences and expertise. Public Safety is looking to the anti-human trafficking related calls for justice in the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls to inform how the national strategy can further strengthen efforts to combat the sexual trafficking of Indigenous people. We will also look to the Standing Committee's study on this important issue. I thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thanks very much for your testimony. Next, we have Mr. Sam Jarudi from the RCMP, officer in charge of the Vulnerable Persons Unit. Up to 6 minutes. Please go ahead. Not hearing, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Girardi, you might have to unmute on your headset because you are unmuted in Zoom, but we cannot hear you.
Sorry about that. That works. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to let you know that the RCMP does not have a statement for today. However, I would like to say that the RCMP remains committed to supporting national and local efforts to effectively combat human trafficking by investigating, disrupting, and bringing to justice those involved in these crimes. The RCMP National Human Trafficking Section centrally facilitates the RCMP's efforts to countering human trafficking through awareness, education, and community outreach, as well as building and enhancing partnerships, supporting operations, advancing operational policy, and internal and external reporting. The RCMP supports the Government of Canada's national strategy to combat human trafficking and remains committed to addressing human trafficking in collaboration with federal and provincial governments and agencies, non-government organizations, as well as law enforcement partners. The extent of human trafficking is difficult to assess due to the clandestine nature of these offenses and the reluctance of victims and witnesses to come forward to law enforcement. However, we are committed to working in partnership with everyone I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. From the Department of Justice, Senior Counsel, Natalie Levman. Natalie, up to 6 minutes.
Thank you for welcoming us all to your study of sex trafficking of Indigenous peoples. I speak with gratitude from the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. The Department of Justice Canada works closely with Public Safety Canada, which leads the national strategy to combat human trafficking, as you've just heard. In particular, Justice Canada is responsible for the criminal law framework governing human trafficking. That framework addresses human trafficking through a range of offenses, including offenses that specifically target human trafficking conduct. While the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act includes an offense that addresses transnational human trafficking, the Criminal Code contains human trafficking specific offenses that address transnational cases as well as those that occur entirely within Canada. The main human trafficking criminal code offenses prohibit recruiting, transporting, or harboring adults or children to exploit them or to facilitate their exploitation by someone else. Exploitation occurs where a reasonable person in the victim's circumstances would believe their physical or psychological safety would be threatened if they failed to provide their labor or services, and this includes sexual services. In determining whether exploitation occurred, courts may consider a broad range of factors, including whether the accused used or threatened to use coercion, deceived the victim, or abused a position of trust, power, or authority. Other trafficking offenses prohibit receiving a material benefit from trafficking children or adults and withholding or destroying travel documents to commit or facilitate trafficking. And this is regardless of whether those documents are authentic. These are all serious offenses with maximum penalties of up to life imprisonment, and more severe penalties are imposed where the victim is under the age of 18 years. Moreover, sentencing principles require courts to give primary consideration to the objectives of denunciation and deterrence when imposing a sentence for an offense that involves the abuse of a person who is vulnerable because of personal circumstances, including because the person is Indigenous and female. Other charges are often laid in trafficking cases, such as sexual assault, uttering threats, intimidation, and extortion, because human trafficking is an offense that often involves the extraction of another person's labor or services over time. Traffickers may commit these other offenses to maintain control over their victims while they extract labor or services from them. Traffickers may also be charged with sex trade offenses in sex trafficking cases, such as procuring others to provide sexual services and profiting from others' sexual services. Individuals who purchase sexual services from trafficking victims may be charged with the criminal code offense that prohibits purchasing sexual services, regardless of whether they knew that the person from whom they purchased sexual services was a trafficking victim. Through Justice Canada's Victims Fund, the Department provides $1 million in funding annually for projects and activities that focus on the needs of victims and survivors of human trafficking. Since 2012, the department has funded 47 human trafficking-related projects by community organizations and law enforcement agencies. These projects include improved services for victims of human trafficking, training for law enforcement officers and frontline service providers working directly with victims of human trafficking, and support for labor trafficking victims. I'd be very happy to answer any questions you may have on the criminal justice system's response to human trafficking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And next, we'll have a presentation from the Department of Indigenous Services. And I'm not sure, the Director General, Natalie Neptune, Ian Kenny, Julian Castengay, who will present? Please go ahead.
Perhaps it's Ian Kenny here. Perhaps I'll start, and I'll be brief to allow my colleagues to share a few remarks. Ian Kenny, Acting Director General of the Social Policy and Programs Branch at Indigenous Services Canada. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide remarks here today. I will speak with you about ISK's Family Violence Prevention Program. This program is a fundamental part of the department's mandate of providing health and social services that promote the safety and well-being of families in Indigenous communities. The program contributes to the efforts to ultimately eliminate all forms of violence. It also plays a role in fulfilling the minister's commitment to grow and maintain Canada's network of shelters serving those individuals who are fleeing domestic violence and/or sexual exploitation. The program, the Family Violence Prevention Program, supports the operation of a network of 46 shelters serving Indigenous communities across the country. These shelters provide emergency support and a vital place of refuge for Indigenous women, children, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people fleeing instances of violence, including sexual exploitation and human trafficking. The program also supports the delivery of Indigenous family violence prevention projects, both on and off reserve, in priority areas that include human trafficking and sexual exploitation. Recently, the Government of Canada announced $44.8 million to Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation over 5 years to build 10 new shelters in First Nations communities on reserve and 2 in the territories. And ISK will be investing an additional $40.8 million in operational funding for these new shelters over the next 5 years and $10.2 million annually thereafter. This will bring the number of ISK's network of shelters to 58. Furthermore, the fall economic statement committed $724.1 million to launch a comprehensive violence prevention strategy to expand access to a continuum of culturally relevant supports for Indigenous women, children, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people facing gender-based violence. This strategy will support new shelters and transitional or second stage housing for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people across the country, including on reserve, in the north, and in urban areas. I might also add this includes the construction and operation of new emergency shelters for Inuit women and children across Inuit Nunangat, as well as in urban centers. These new investments will be jointly delivered by ISK and CMHC. Thank you.
Anyone to follow up with your group? Ms. Neptune?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members for inviting us to be here today. My name is Natalie Neptune, and my comments will focus more on the work we are doing within Indigenous Service Canada that have to do with child and family service reform for First Nations children and families. Although the Indigenous population up to the age of 14 made up 7.7% of all Canadian children, they represent 52.2% of the children in care. And we also know that studies have highlighted that having been in a child welfare system was the most common feature among women and girls who entered into prostitution. We recognize the relationship between investing in the safety and well-being of children and improved outcomes for these children, their families, and the communities. For this reason, Indigenous Services Canada is committed to ensuring that that families at risk receive support and prevention services designed to maintain familial support systems and to keep children in their communities connected to their language and culture. The First Nations Child and Family Services Program has received significant investments over the past years. To support the program and to make it truly child-centered, community-directed, and focused on prevention and early intervention. Recently, we've brought significant changes to the program. Most notably, upon reaching the age of majority, youth in care can continue to benefit from the program for an additional 2 years. This ensures they have the support they need to transition into adulthood on a healthy path. Other recent progress towards achieving the goal of reducing the number of Indigenous children in care includes the federal Indigenous Child and Family Services legislation. The act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families came into force on January 1st, 2020. The act establishes national principles such as the best interests of the child, cultural continuity, substantive equality to help guide the provision of child and family services in relation to Indigenous children. Simply put, the Act provides a path for Indigenous peoples to choose their own solutions for their children and families and to create a better future for the generations to come. All told, the Child and Family Services reform sector of Indigenous Services Canada is focused on ensuring healthy, strong, prosperous Indigenous families and children, thus reducing their vulnerability to negative outcomes such as being victims of the sex trafficking trade. Thank you.
Merci. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, we have very limited...
Monsieur le Président.
Point of order, Chairman. We cannot hear Mr. Joidi well. For interpreters, can you please sort out the situation so that I can hear him better? Mr. Jarodi's sound needs to be resolved.
D'accord. Est-ce que ça marche? Merci.
Will be better.
Est-ce que c'est mieux?
Is that better now? Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We're very tight for time. Don't have Jamie, the first, the conservative questioner, or Gary, or who would like to start? Mr. Vierson, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Madam or Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today as well. Just want to go probably to the RCMP or the Justice Department, just around conviction rates. So we see less than 1 in 10 human trafficking charges result in a guilty fine. The vast majority of those charges are either stayed, withdrawn, or dismissed or discharged. I'll start with the RCMP. Is there a significant challenge with securing justice for trafficking victims?
I would suggest that actually this is a question more for justice, because for the RCMP we do the investigation and we prepare the files for the prosecutor. We're not involved in the process afterwards.
Thank you for that question. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to review the new human trafficking Juristat that was released in early May, but it does speak to some of the issues you've just raised. And it does raise issues also about whether or not human trafficking cases end up with convictions for other charges where the elements of the human trafficking offense cannot be made out. And so we know that that happens in some cases, and we know that other offenses are regularly charged in human trafficking cases, as per my comments. I'm responsible for the criminal law. I'm not a prosecutor. I wish to clarify that point. I think a prosecutor could speak better to charging practices and in terms of qualitative data. But that is my understanding, having worked closely with prosecutors and reviewed various research, including the Statistics Canada report, which speaks to the issue of concern.
Yeah, so that I appreciate that. What are some of the more common offenses used to convict traffickers then?
Well, you'd have to look at the human trafficking Juristat for statistical analyses, but in terms of jurisprudence, which I can speak to, sex trade offenses are often charged in human trafficking cases that involve sexual exploitation, obviously not labor exploitation for obvious reasons. But a range of different offenses, as per my comments and my opening remarks, are regularly charged in these cases. They're complex and they involve different kinds of offending depending upon the facts of a given case.
In Canada, the weight of a human trafficking conviction often rests on the testimony of the victim instead of on the actions of the trafficker. This is due to a narrow definition of exploitation in Canada's human trafficking offenses. To fully align us with the UN Palermo Protocol, the definition of human trafficking would need to be changed to no longer require to prove a victim's personal fear for their safety. Can you comment a little bit on that, Ms. Levin?
Sure. You might be interested in reviewing some of the case law out of the Ontario Court of Appeal, starting with the AA decision from 2015 in particular. You'll find that the court confirms the parliamentary record. The definition of exploitation sets a low bar. It doesn't require proof of fear on the part of the victim, but whether or not a reasonable person in the victim's circumstances would believe that either their physical or psychological safety would be threatened if they failed to provide the labor or services. And this is in full compliance with Article 3 of the Trafficking Protocol, which requires 3 elements to be criminalized: act, means, and exploitative purpose. So our definition is consistent with that definition in Article 3.
Could we bring some legislative clarity to that, just around that, like it's being clarified in the courts? Is there is there ability to bring some legislative clarity to that?
Well, it's always up to those responsible for legislation to decide to amend it. I would suggest that removing the current definition could harm the very helpful case law that we have interpreting it. It's not just the AA decision, but several other decisions out of the Ontario Court of Appeal that have given full effect to that definition. I'm not saying it can't be done. It certainly wouldn't be up to me to choose to do it. But we do have a workable definition according to Canadian jurisprudence.
Ms. Van de Bogart, much of the National Human Strategy to combat human trafficking is devoted to prevention. What kind of percentage of the funding goes to prevention?
I'll have to interrupt. There's only 10 seconds left.
Oh.
And we're going to be going overtime. Perhaps that can get picked up in a subsequent question answer, but right now I'm going to ask Mrs. Zan to go ahead for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. And actually, I will be getting there. So thank you for starting that question. I just wanted to say to begin with that I know our government has acknowledged the fact that Indigenous women and girls experience some of the highest rates of violence in this country, and that COVID-19, the pandemic, has only exacerbated this already dire situation. Recently, we've seen deeply distressing stories in the media about the treatment or lack of proper treatment of Indigenous children in care, and this is unacceptable. When women are provided the supports that they need to allow them to evade potentially compromising situations, there is a lowered likelihood for exploitation. So with regard to specific funding for Indigenous women for gender-based violence prevention programming, funding now has been distinguished as capacity building for Indigenous and 2S LGBTQIA+ people. And that's because of the missing and murdered women and girls inquiry that necessitated that distinction. The allocated funding for this year's budget, 2021, represents $415 million specifically for the Department of Women and Gender Equality, which contributes to a total of $601.3 million to advance the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence. So I would like to ask public safety. In 2019, Canada's National Strategy to Combat Human Trafficking added the new pillar of empowerment to emphasize the important role that victims and survivors play in combating human trafficking. So can you update our committee on what is being done under this new pillar, what kind of work is being done, and what new funding is being provided to grassroots organizations to facilitate trauma-informed support? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Oh, sorry, can you hear me better? Thank you
That's
very
good.
much for the question. Sorry about that. So I can speak to the monies that has been allocated to grassroots organizations, including Indigenous organizations. In 2019, my apologies, in 2020, under the National Strategy to Combat Human Trafficking, both Public Safety and Women and Gender Equality Canada was awarded up to $22.4 million. And it's that money that allowed us to support 63 organizations working to address human trafficking and to support at-risk populations and survivors. Speaking specifically from Public Safety, we received up to $8.4 million out of that initial $22.4 million. And we are supporting 20 projects that work to prevent and address human trafficking and support survivors. And out of those 20 projects, 15 of those projects serve Indigenous populations. When we're looking at the types of projects that we are currently supporting. Some of those organizations are delivering empowerment programs, youth at risk pilot projects, and also youth hackathons. And youth hackathons are pretty amazing to me because what they do is that it's an event in which they bring students and software developers and socially responsible technology companies together, and they develop ideas on how they can use social media to target and combat human trafficking, which of course is directly, all of us are on social media, but we know that the young are drawn to that. So that's some of the examples of the information or of the monies that is going to grassroots organizations to deal with empowerment.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Mr. Chair, how much longer do I have?
Minute and a half.
Oh, great. So I have a question now regarding, well, the RCMP and public safety, whoever would like to answer this, but we know that human trafficking generates large sums of profits. And we know that under DRAP, the previous Conservative government's cuts led to all 13 integrated proceeds of crime units being disbanded, which were dedicated to addressing money laundering. And recently, $98 million was approved for the RCMP with teams stood in BC, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec City. So what work is being done to focus on the money laundering aspect of the crime of sexual trafficking, human trafficking? Oops, sorry, pressed the wrong one. Could the RCMP perhaps answer that?
30 seconds, yeah.
Unfortunately, I cannot respond on behalf of money laundering. It's not my area of responsibility.
Okay. All
but
right.
I can bring a response in writing afterwards if you wish.
All right. And is there anybody else here, public safety, somebody who wants to comment on that, please?
No. 5, 4. We're right at a time. And Ms. Blaney, in order to ensure that you get your question in, we'll have to extend. So, and we're not able to extend too much, but could I have a motion to extend to allow? Thanks, Mr. Sangari, Lenore, thank you. So all in favor, we'll extend briefly after 1 o'clock, but right now, Madame Bérubé, 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm on the territory of the Cree Anishinaabe here in Quebec, and I'm going to put a question to Ms. Van de Bogart. You talked about telephone helplines earlier. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of this helpline so that people can report human trafficking?
Thank you for the question. I hope you can hear through the translation. Okay, so the hotline is a toll-free service. I mentioned that it's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it refers victims to local law enforcement, to shelters, and to other supports and services. Because it's available all the time, and also I mentioned in over 200 languages, 27 of them Indigenous languages, it allows an opportunity for people to call and obtain all sorts of various information and to be put in place with specific supports that they may need. We speak about victims, but it allows people to, find avenues for shelter, perhaps issues around sexual abuse and physical abuse, domestic violence, and information from law enforcement as well. The hotline has trained operators, and they are trauma informed as well. And so there is an understanding and a recognition when they are speaking to these individuals of how to interact with them and how to support the victims, and to be able to direct them to the supports that they require.
So another question for you. For Indigenous peoples, do they use these services, and is it in line with their culture? Do you have statistics, any breakdown on the use of this service?
The hotline does keep track of some information. I do not have that at my fingertips, but I would be happy to get back to you on what's possible.
La question peut s'adresser.
And now a question to all of you. Do you have recommendations to improve the capacity of government institutions and Indigenous organisations to detect possible victims and where human trafficking is taking place?
I'm not sure if you mentioned of everybody. One of the things that I wanted to speak to you about is one of the pillars that the national strategy is about is building capacity and working with our partnerships. And so what we're doing is we're working in collaboration with federal, provincial, territorial partners. I work with my colleagues in other departments to strengthen, to share ideas, to inform. And part of that is consultation and conversations with grassroots organizations and elders, Indigenous leaders, Indigenous organizations to try and find ways that we can respond and support. I think what's really important is that the voices of those that are survivors and that those that have been impacted by human trafficking is important in order for us to build, to strengthen, and to continue to grow, to support through public safety is what I would say.
And for the RCMP, I would say that building trust with communities is the most important to tackle this issue. As mentioned earlier, victims and witnesses or their families very reluctant to come to law enforcement. However, we've built a lot of networks and relationships, and we participate in a lot of community events and discussions on human trafficking to have that exposure between police and the public. And hopefully that pays out over time. It's not something that can be achieved overnight. We recognize that, but we're working hard on that and supporting that also with training our police officers and employees in general on being culturally sensitive and trauma, and as well as utilizing trauma-informed approaches.
1 minute.
Mon autre question.
I have another question. Can you talk about best practices or promising practices when it comes to protecting Indigenous victims?
From, I don't know if public safety wants to add anything to that, or the other representative speaking about shelters, but from an RCMP perspective, we definitely work on two levels. First, with the local level, with local partners. As I mentioned, to strengthen relationships that can then benefit the victims and utilizing a victim lens approach, as well as a trauma-informed approach, but also at the same approach, at the same kind of within the same scope. But from kind of a national perspective, we work, for example, with the Ombudsman of Victims of Crime. And we're currently, for example, developing a victims' rights card that would be presented by police officers to victims, advising them of their rights. So there are a lot of projects, a lot of things ongoing, practical at the local level, but also that we are initiating at the national level to be able to support frontline police in their interactions. As mentioned, culturally sensitive, trauma-informed, and victim lens.
Thank you very much. And to conclude, Ms. Blaney, 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you for getting the committee, everyone, a few extra minutes so I could do my questions. So I'm going to ask this question, and I'm really going to allow whoever is the best person to respond. So just giving you a heads up before I start. So there was a submission to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights in 2018. The Native Women's Association of Canada stated that some of the recurring themes that contribute to the recruitment of Indigenous women into human trafficking include precarious housing and poor living conditions, high rates of unemployment and unstable employment and low working wages, lack of access to social and economic resources and programs, prior exposure to human trafficking and the sex trade from a young age through family or friends, family violence and the impacts of colonialism, such as residential school experience and intergenerational trauma. I'm just wondering if I could get a little bit of specific examples of how this is being addressed by the federal government, if it is at all.
Like that.
So it's Michelle from Public Safety. I apologize. I can't see other people. I'm not sure if it's appropriate for me to speak at this point.
Please.
Please? Okay, sorry. Okay, so what I would say is, I mentioned it in my opening statements, all of which, basically mirrored all of which you just highlighted. And we know that the complexity of human trafficking. And so I would say that the Government of Canada, first starting with the introduction of the funding for the hotline, which was launched in May of 2019, followed by the National Strategy to Combat Human Trafficking, which is a 5-year project. There are some concrete examples that I can share with you. So first and foremost, when we were developing this strategy, we ensured that we did regional and national consultations, and those involved conversations with elders, with Indigenous leaders, with Indigenous
I'm really
communities.
looking for concrete.
Sorry?
Like, I'm not trying to be rude, but I am looking for
fine.
concrete. I understand the process, but the point is there was some very clear things that are contributing to women to continue to go in this direction and be forced into this direction. So I just want to know, housing, employment, those are key things. So what about those? A hotline isn't that.
Sure, certainly. So I wonder if my partners that manage specific programs may be able to give you your answer. We do provide money and we support grassroots organizations, but from a public safety perspective, it's about allowing those organizations to be able to manage their programs. So I wonder if perhaps my colleagues would be best to answer that, if that's fair.
That would be great. Thank you so much. Ms. Nipitan.
Yes, thank you for the question. And I'm hoping from a program perspective, it will help. As I indicated earlier, I work in the area of First Nation Child and Family Services programming. Over the past years, and even most recently, as I've indicated, we've provided or there have been significant investments made into our programs to allow for the extension of supports, as I stated earlier, of children aging out of care and maintaining those supports for an additional 2 years to help them, find their way or get on the right path to avoid falling into those pitfalls that you've mentioned. As well, we've also looked at our program, and we have, acknowledged, as you've indicated, the effects of colonization, historical trauma, and cultural dislocation.
Okay, fair enough. I think that's good. It's not really answering the question, so I'm just going to move on. So the Native Women's Association also in the same report talked about identifying and assisting Indigenous victims and survivors of human trafficking and exploitation, and how it's been greatly hindered by a lack of disaggregated and cross-jurisdictional data. And we hear this again and again in every report that we do, that data continues to be this big challenge. I'm just wondering if there's been any work done on that, and if there's been a recognition of the importance of Indigenous ownership of the data that is collected in relation to the Indigenous experience, and how that fact of cross-jurisdictional data can be addressed, because this continues to be an issue. And I only have 1 minute left, so whoever can answer that best, I would really appreciate it. Please step up. We don't have a lot of time.
I'm wondering if you would like to hear from Statistics Canada on these issues. There is data out there, and a lot of it has been spearheaded by Indigenous groups, but this is really a question, I think, for Statistics Canada, and I note that they're not here.
Okay, I'm done with my questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Blaney. Members of the committee, Ms. Butt from the Department of Women and Gender Equality, the Director General, has been able to join us. We have an absolute hard stop of 1:15, so I would allow the clerk to ensure that Ms. Butt is technically attached to our committee, and allow her to make a brief statement. So, Mr. Clerk, can you deal with that?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Ms. Butt, I'll ask you to introduce yourself, tell us where you're calling from, and if interpretation agrees they can hear you adequately, we'll proceed with your opening statement. Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you. This is Alia Butt, Director General of Policy and External Relations with Women and Gender Equality Canada. Can you hear me all right? All right. My deepest apologies. Seems like our systems weren't compatible with the INAN committee Zoom, so I think we've sorted it out now. Would you like me to go ahead with my remarks?
Clerk,
Okay.
yeah, well, you're getting a nod. Please go ahead, and thank you for joining.
Okay, bonjour. J'aimerais souligner d'emblée, je participe à...
I would like to say that I am participating here from Ottawa, and I'm on the traditional territory, which is unceded of the Anishinaabe people. And thank you for welcoming here today to provide some comments for your study on human trafficking of Indigenous people. We know that Indigenous women and girls are newcomers to Canada, and Black and racialized women and those who live in poverty are particularly at risk to be victims of human trafficking. In fact, according to Statistics Canada in 2019, 95% of victims of human trafficking identified by police in Canada were women and girls.
For the purposes of sexual exploitation is a form of gender-based violence. WAGE is leading the government's efforts to develop a national action plan to end gender-based violence. Budget 2021 committed an investment of $601.3 million over 5 years to advance this national action plan, which will be achieved in collaboration with Indigenous partners, provincial and territorial governments, and civil society. WAGE will receive $415 million of this investment, including $105 million over 5 years to enhance the gender-based violence program, which includes efforts to stop human trafficking. WAGE has been working closely with public safety to support the national strategy to combat human trafficking. Last year, WAGE launched a call for proposals to support organizations on the front lines to develop and implement promising practices to enhance supports for at-risk populations, victims, and survivors of human trafficking. We approved 43 projects to receive $14 million in funding. Some projects we funded, for example, include the Nova Scotia Native Women's Association that is working to develop and implement the Nova Scotia Indigenous Human Trafficking Prevention Strategy that will advance knowledge and enhance empowerment supports for at-risk populations and survivors of human trafficking in Nova Scotia. Also, the Alberta Native Friendship Centres Association that is working to develop and implement an Indigenous youth-led culturally relevant prevention training and education program that will advance knowledge, awareness, and empower at-risk Indigenous youth and Indigenous survivors of human trafficking in Alberta. We are also striving to ensure that organizations that provide critical services to victims and survivors of gender-based violence are supported through the pandemic. For example, last year, as part of the government's COVID-19 economic response plan, we at WAGE provided $90 million in funding to women's shelters, sexual assault centers, and women's organizations and other organizations providing supports to over 800,000 women and children experiencing gender-based violence across the country. We also work closely with Indigenous Services Canada to ensure supports to Indigenous women and children experiencing gender-based violence. As part of Budget 2021 investments that I just mentioned, $200 million will continue to support this critical sector. Another $55 million has been specifically earmarked to bolster the capacity of Indigenous women and 2S LGBTQIA+ organizations to provide gender-based violence prevention programming aimed at addressing the root causes of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people. Through all of our program and policy work at WAGE, we continue towards advancing gender equality by removing systemic barriers, preventing and addressing gender-based violence, and enhancing women's economic security and increasing their representation in leadership roles. Thank you, and again, apologies for the issues at the onset of the meeting.
No problem, and thank you once again, members. If there are further, obviously we have to leave now, but the clerk has advised me that he will accept further questions to submit to all of our witnesses today if you have them. So please feel free to submit further questions as you have. Witnesses, thank you all so much. We all have busy times, but this is such an important topic, and we want to thank you for your participation today. And with that, I will take a motion to adjourn. Mr. Pawlowski, Mr. Viersen, all in favor? That's carried. Thank you all. See you Thursday.
Thank you.